Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
We're into winter now, and
No.
I put the heating on, so
Thank you.
that's because I was cold.
Oh,
I'm assuming that others will be cold as well. Okay, those of you who were here for the last two sessions, or even if you were not here, doesn't matter. Today we are doing the historical books, but we started off with the general overview of the Bible and talking about the number of books, how many books there are, and we said it depends what Bible you have in your hand. You could have 66 or you could have 73 books. And then in the next session we went through the first 5 books of the Bible, which are known as the Pentateuch or Torah or the Law. Can you remember the names of the first 5 books?
Yes.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we said Genesis, one of the main persons in there is Abraham. So that's one of the patriarchs or the head of the patriarchs, so to say. So then we move on. It's easy to remember the story I was saying, if you can remember the main characters in those 5 books. So you have Abraham, then you move on to Isaac, you move on to Jacob, you move on to Joseph, and they end up where? In Egypt, to slavery. From then on, we have Moses as the main person, who enters in the book of Exodus, and then in the next 3 books, 4 including Exodus, Moses is the key person. He's the main figure. Yes, he's got Aaron with him and others to sort of support, but he is the key person. So you have the story then moving on with Moses, and then Exodus into Leviticus, then where they are wandering in the desert for 40 years, and they are given the law there, and then the Numbers talks about the counting of people, how many people are there, and there are 2 census mentioned there. And then the book of Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. Hello, Kevin.
Sorry, we're late.
That's all right.
We're just coming, so
Yeah, good.
I'll jump over there. Yeah.
So we ended Deuteronomy in a way with Moses, and then who comes in after Moses? Kind of takes the story further. Joshua. Okay. This chair there as well.
Yes,
Okay. So we ended with Deuteronomy with the death of Moses, and we said then Joshua takes on. And then today, Joshua is the first book in the historical books. So we're going to start with it. Do you have any idea about what's in the historical books before I start talking about the historical books? They're the next 12. Depending on which Bible again you have, you could have 12 or you could have 16 books as part of the historical books. So, can you remember any of those books that are categorized as set of the historical books?
Kings.
We said Joshua, yes.
Kings.
So Kings 1 and 2, Chronicles 1 and 2, Samuel 1 and 2, Ezra, yeah. And when you think of Ezra, you could think of Nehemiah as well. Ezra and Nehemiah. Yeah. We covered most of them. This the Job actually comes in the wisdom literature. Yeah. Ruth. Yes. Esther. Judith, if you go into apocryphal books. Tobit. Again, if you go into include the apocryphal book, Maccabees 1 and 2. So these are mostly the books. What do you think could be the main characters in there?
Nehemiah.
Well, Samuel.
But the other book, sorry, we'll go to. Didn't mention is Judges. Judges is part of that as well. So yes, this Nehemiah, there's Ezra, it's indicated from the names. But what are the great people, really?
King David,
Saul, King Saul, then
David.
David,
Solomon.
Solomon, Samuel himself, as well as that's one of the key persons.
Gideon.
So you see, if you're building a story, you can actually, it's a very systematic story. You know, we say there are 73 or 66 books, but they actually tell the same story. And especially in the Old Testament, the story moves on with different people, and the story is the same of God and people, and different characters come in and move on to the next episode and next episode and next episode. So we started with, I'm going back, Abraham on to Moses, and today we go on to Joshua. Then you will see in the historical books, it from Joshua moves on to Judges, then Samuel, then Saul, then David, then Solomon, and then other kings come in which are less known, but there are kings and then prophets come in and all that kind of. So it's one story, you see, and you can actually remember the whole Bible. Sometimes we think, oh, we don't know much about the Bible. We haven't read much about the Bible. But those key persons then tell you what's happening. Like Moses, you think of Moses, you think of Egypt, you think of Exodus, you think of moving from sort of Egypt into the Promised Land. And there's a lot going on about that in our historical books. Any questions at this time?
Not yet.
Okay, let's move on. Historical books. There are 12, or as I said, could be 16, depending on whether you include the Apocrypha books in there or not. And Apocrypha, we said Maccabees 1 and 2, there's Book of Judith, there is Book of Tobit as well. That could be part of these historical books. They cover a period of about 800 years. So basically it's a history of Israel. These books actually are fundamentally history of Israel. You can read these books just simply as a history. If you say making of a nation of Israel, and where do they come from? And where they are today, as we see. But where did they come from? And you can just literally read it as a history, without thinking about God. So what makes it different when we read it in the Bible as a Bible history, then what we have is, in the midst of this history and all the events that are happening, you put God in there. And that's what changes the whole perspective. It's basically a history of the nation of Israel and nations sort of around there. But what the Israelites see it as, and what we as Christians now see it as, is God right in the middle of whatever is happening. So some people might think, when you studying the story of the Exodus, it was just a group of people, Israelites, moving from Egypt and moving into another area, land. But what we see is, because it's God actually leading them. And that puts a different perspective onto it. This room is getting warm, I'm putting this one off. Closer to me. So it's a history that covers 800 years. These 12 or 16 books talk about main characters, conquering and possession of the Canaan, the land there, the country, people. It talks about the reigns of judges, because you would see Good morning. So, can you see from there? Because you might, or this shale next bit, or just move there.
Can you make it a bit broader? I can see.
I can see it in the print from. Can you make it before there if you can?
No, but I'll try next time.
Alright.
Yeah. Some of them are slightly bolder than the others.
Yeah.
So it talks about the conquering and possession of Canaanites under the leadership of Joshua. The reign of the judges that follows after Joshua. Then we are talking in general about the historical books. Then it moves on to the establishment of monarchy and the kingdom or kingship. Then the division of Israel into the northern and southern kingdom. And then the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria. And then the exile of the southern kingdom into Babylon and return to Jerusalem under the leadership of Nehemiah and Ezra. So those are the key themes in the historical books. Move on to the first book, and that is the book of Joshua. And we see Moses dies, and then it's Joshua who takes on the leadership. And he's the one then who leads people into, so to say, the promised land. And the first place they enter in, do you remember where? The first city they conquer. It still exists.
Jericho.
Jericho. It's very much alive, so to say. And I've been to that city 3 times. Because that's where you take a cable car and you go on to the Mount of Temptations of Jesus Christ. It's high up on the mountain. But it's a beautiful city, Jericho. So that was, and there are remains actually, the archaeological evidence that can go back to you when you're talking about the walls of Jericho. You know, they were singing, and then those walls fell with the earthquake and things like that. The remains are still there. And when you go on the cable from Jericho, you take the cable car going up there. Underneath, actually, you can see some of the remains there. That they say it's one of the oldest cities in the world, even today. So Joshua literally means salvation. So the time period is roughly around 1400 BC. That's when sort of Joshua took over. This is a bit old. As same theme and purpose of the book. So what do you find in this book? Again, repeating the same: possessing, conquering, and division of the promised lands. This book is designed to show God's faithfulness to His promises and doing for Israel exactly as He had promised. So, what was the promise? It goes back to the promise to Abraham.
Okay.
I'll make you sort of a big nation, your descendants, and all that kind of thing. So that promise is sort of being fulfilled now also. I'll make you a great nation. So that's the beginning of becoming a nation. Until then, they'd just been tribes. So it's a journey towards, they didn't have any land. So Abraham moved from one place to another and wandered around. Then they ended up in Egypt. It's not their land, so to say. They are slaves there. And this is when they are entering into Canaan or the promised land. That's the beginning of the full, from their point of view, and the beginning of the promise of God. Now, I'll come to this slide later on. I think I'll skip that here. So again, outline of the book: the invasion of Canaan, which was the promised land for them. The commissioning of Joshua as a leader, the crossing of the Jordan, and then the conquest of Canaan. And under Joshua, Israel becomes a nation and settled in the promised land. Now, what was the area, if I were to go back, see whether it comes next. So, let me go back to the previous slide. Now, this is the area that was conquered by Joshua at that time, under his leadership. And actually, you can see a lot in the geographical terms, where it is today and where it was that time, and what were the nations around there. Of course, they are still there, and the area is still there, and some of the nations and the areas known as is Oman, I think up there is Lebanon, and there's Egypt on that side, there's Syria up there, and there's Jordan, I think this area kind of thing. So that is the area. And if you see, I'll come back to it later on as well, I think. But these names you see, actually Joshua divided those, then they conquered the land, and he divided the land among the tribes of Israel. So his sons of Jacob, 12 of them.
Yeah.
And there were only 11 who were given the land. One of the tribes wasn't given the land, the Levi, the tribe of Levi. Why? Do you know?
Because he was the preacher.
Because
He was the priest.
he was the priest, he's the line of priests. So their duty, you remember last time we said, then God told Moses to build a tabernacle. So the Levi tribe was given kind of the role of worship priests and leaders, spiritual leaders. So their duty was mainly to take care of worship. And then all the other tribes were told that they should, so to say, pay for the Levites. And that's where the idea of tithing and all that comes from as well. So they were not given the land, but they had to live on because of the service they did in terms of worshipping and organizing and leading worship to God. So 11 tribes were given the land.
So for Joseph, but he's not, that wouldn't be him, he's not.
It was probably somewhere this was part of the Joseph's area, yeah. Simeon and Judas. And Levites are not there. So.
No.
Probably we'll come to it because it is very important that keep that map in mind. And I've got a couple of others. It explains a lot of things about what we read there and the history and some of the stories that we read today, where they go back to. So let's move on to Joshua. We said that. Then the next book. So basically Joshua, if you want to remember what he did, basically is he conquered the land, he divided the lands into the tribes. That's it. That's his main role. So after Moses, when Joshua dies, then of course they need a leader again. Now they don't have one particular or significant one leader as we could name in the past, like Abraham and like Jacob, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses and Joshua. Now it comes the time of the judges. And there's 7 cycles of apostasy and judgment and deliverance. So the people of Israel went through ups and downs. And these judges then played a role as leaders, both spiritual but also political. So they had a dual role to guide people spiritually but also in terms of in their day-to-day matters. The time period is around 1050 to 1000 BC. Author is uncertain, don't know exactly who wrote, we don't even know exactly who wrote the book of Joshua, and also the same with Judges. Tradition tells us that Samuel wrote the book. Then the Hebrew title is Shofetzim, meaning judges, rulers or deliverers or saviors. And the title of the book gets its name from the leaders called judges whom God raised up to deliver Israel from their oppressors. So there were fighting going on, even though they have conquered the land, they've divided the land into different tribes, but it doesn't mean all is good as bad. So
Who was in the land when they conquered it?
Canaanites.
Just the Canaanites.
Yeah. And the Moabites, so it was as we saw in that map. There'll be another map coming where you will see there were other sort of people living around. So again, Judges' theme and purpose. Judges bridges the gap between Joshua to Prophet Samuel. So Judges actually cover the period in between after Joshua and when Samuel comes in, the great kind of again prophet, and then we know the monarchy starts from Samuel's time when we mentioned King Saul. So the book of Judges actually covers that period in between. Samuel and the beginning of the monarchy under King Saul and King David. The contrast between Joshua and Judges is striking. Israel goes from the thrill of victory to the agony of defeat. So Joshua conquers, and then, as I said, it doesn't mean after that it was all peace and calm and tranquility. The wars go on. They were defeated at times, then they were victorious at times. So that went on for even during David's time, isn't it? Saul's time, David's time, and Solomon's time, and so continuous sort of struggle from freedom to oppression, and from advancement to retrogression. So Judges is kind of going back and going forwards, but is still in the process of being a nation and establishing themselves. This is roughly the time scale and the sum of the names of the Judges. We don't know many of the names. The 5 indivisible units of chronology, so they cover the period between 1350 to 1014 BC, for a total of 336 years. That's the period between Joshua and Samuel. So Judges cover sort of more than 3 centuries. Some of the main ones you might remember, I don't even remember all of them, to be honest. But some of them, Deborah, I think we might be more familiar with. Samson, I think we know all the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson was one of the judges as well. Ibaz, Elon, Abton, Gideon, Gideon, Abimelech, Zola, Shire. So we don't know much about them, but they were leaders of Israel during that 300 and sort of 30 years period. And they led people or guided people, again, if you want to remember, between Joshua and Samuel. I think that's important to sort of to remember. When you're thinking of Judges, they are the leaders at the time between Joshua and Samuel. And then from Samuel onwards, I think you'll find it easier to take the story kind of further up. Another book then, after the Judges, we have the period of Ruth. It's a small book. Author again is uncertain. The date is about 1000 BC. Jewish tradition points to Samuel, and that Samuel might have written. The book gets its name from the title itself, as Ruth being the great person or character in the book of Ruth. She was a Moabite woman. Do you know the story? Have you read the story of Ruth?
Yes.
Yeah. She was married outside, sort of, to a different people, and then when things got worse, she comes back with her mother-in-law, Naomi, and she marries. What's his name? Can't remember the name now. Boaz, yeah. And then she's one of the persons also mentioned in the genealogy. So she becomes a great-grandmother of David. So it's a short story, really a story of faithfulness of the person. And we see an outsider, but because of her faithfulness, becomes part of the salvation history. As we said, that she is the grandmother of King David. And she's mentioned in genealogy in Matthew. Ruth again, theme and purpose. Ruth is the story of a couple in Israel. I think I went ahead of what the slides are. So that's what it is really. It's a story of loyalty, purity, and love. when anarchy and selfishness was generally the rule. So she remains faithful to her family, but then also faithful to God. Since Ruth was a Gentile, the book illustrates God's desire to bring the Gentile into the family of God. So in a way, there's the idea that whoever remains faithful or listens to God, actually God's love is there for all of them. So that's at the heart of Ruth's story, faithfulness really. And she exemplifies that participation in the kingdom of God is decided not by blood and birth, but by conforming to the will of God. And that's the theme that later on continues to develop, and in the New Testament it becomes kind of obvious that God is for everyone, and Jesus came for everyone. Then from Ruth we move on to Samuel. So there are two books of Samuel, date roughly around 930 BC, and later the author who wrote 1 and 2 Samuel is not certain, but it could have been Samuel himself. The Jewish tradition says that it was written by Samuel. These two books give the history of monarchs of Israel in the early period of the monarchy. And that's when you start, the first time, you had spiritual leaders also playing as political role. But people, when they looked around and they said other people have kings, rule over them, and people of Israel ask for a king. And in the beginning God warns them, don't ask for a king. They say, no, we do need the first king then they get is King Saul. Picks up the history of Israel where Judges left. So you see the story. Ruth's story is kind of just comes in between, sort of as a standalone character as well, in a way. So even if you skip the book of Ruth and her story, you can still move on from Judges on to Samuel. About kings, so First Samuel mainly talks about King Saul, and Second Samuel is about King David. So again, if you want to remember who is the main person in Samuel. I know the book is called Samuel. He's the prophet there. He's one of the key persons. But when you think of then the kings, the first king is Saul, that's 1 Samuel. Then the second after him is King David, that is 2 Samuel. Continues the story of Israel's kingdom from Saul's death to the reign of David. It's about the 40 years reign of David. So Samuel 2. In the typical fashion of the Bible, which tells the story of its leaders with their strengths and weaknesses. And that somebody said, I don't know who I was talking to, and they said, one of the beauty of the Bible and the biblical history is that it doesn't shy away from talking about the weaknesses of its characters. They're not just good and holy men or women who were chosen by God. They do have their challenges and difficulties, and they do even sometimes do nasty things as well. We have the story of David himself as well. So Samuel portrays the good and the bad and the ugly of the life of King David. Then from Samuel we move on to the kings. Again, Kings and Chronicles are very much similar in nature. They both tell about the history of Israel. Again, the author unknown, Jews credited its writing to Jeremiah, that is Prophet Jeremiah. We'll be talking about in the prophets section. Date about 550 BC, written during Babylonian exile. We'll talk about it, what it was. Writer is very likely to be one of the exiles who lived in Babylon, perhaps Ezra or Ezekiel or Jeremiah. But there is no conclusive evidence of who wrote the first book of Kings. The book traces the history of the kings of Israel and Judah from Solomon to Babylon captivity. So Samuel ends with David. Samuel 1 starts with Saul, Samuel 2 main character is David, and then ends with David, and then First Kings takes the story from King David to Solomon. So you see the connection between the history. And then, right as well, and then these books trace the history of the kings of Israel from Judah. Israel and Judah, I'll talk about it, what you mean, because sometimes it's confusing. The Israel is used for people, as people of Israel, but Israel is used also for a geographical area, for the land. It stresses that unfaithfulness to God's covenant results in decline and captivity. That's First Kings. Then the Second Kings talks about Elijah and his successor, Elisha. So you have the story of Solomon and the two great figures as leaders, spiritual leaders or prophets, come in, and that is Elijah. We all know about that, one of the greatest prophets in the Old Testament, and even Jesus quotes him or talks about him. And then Elisha was his successor. It also continues the story of two kingdoms, northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, until they are finally conquered and taken it. I'll explain that in the next slides, when it happens and how it happened. It happened actually after Solomon. So the United Kingdom, so to say, was only during the period of Saul, King David, and King Solomon. After Solomon, all those tribes, we saw the land given to the tribes, is split into two. And that's what was called Southern Kingdom and Northern Kingdom. But there will be more coming up. Israel fell to Assyria in 722. That is Israel not as a people, but the land, the geographical area. Judah fell to the Babylonians 586 BC, and that was the land you saw at the bottom was Judah and Simeon, that area given, and top was the 10 tribes that they had the land, or 9. I will break here until you have any questions. A lot more history is coming actually, and that you can relate or connect to actually what's happening today as well.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, it's been a sort of cauldron for ever since the beginning of the Old Testament, really, hasn't it?
From the time of Moses, sort of moving on to to the promised land, journey towards promise, but mainly then Joshua was taking that area, conquered that area. Yeah. But in the next page, it's important to understand that history, because when we read the New Testament, because I know some people say, why do we need the Old Testament? Because we got the New Testament now, and the promise of God sending a Savior has been fulfilled in the sort of Jesus Christ. Do we need to? But there's a lot that goes back into that history, and we need to understand. You're talking about. We'll be talking about Israel. So Israel as a country, as a geographical area, its capital was Samaria. And you hear about the Samaritans in Good Samaritan and Samaritan women, and Jesus did not go to the Samaritan sort of area, or would go, and Jews wouldn't go there. Actually, that history goes back there. We'll be talking about it. I'll clarify what happened there, and why centuries later still people thought, well, they are the Samaritans, we don't want to have to do anything with them. Any questions? If not, we'll have a cup of tea and coffee. I've got probably 5 or 6 maps now to show you and to make comment on that. Now this is here, you saw Joshua divide the land that they have conquered, and that land became as a one nation, one country. And that happened during the time of King David. So which was known as the United, well, it was just known as the kingdom, but sometimes we now refer to as United Kingdom because this was divided into two. So this is the area, all the area that King David kind of ruled on. So you see these areas still there, Moab, Ammon, with the different names, but obviously the land doesn't change. You know, the borders change over time, has changed, depending on who is in power and who conquers the land. But the area still is there. But that was the area that King David ruled. And that's what he passed on to King Solomon afterwards. So it was the land of the 12 tribes, so to say, or 11 tribes. Then, after King David, the land was divided. And not after David, after Solomon. After Solomon died, the land was divided into two. And that's where earlier we said southern and northern kingdom. So this was the line. That's where this bit became the land of Judah, and the other one was known as the land of Israel. So Israel, when you're reading the Bible, when you read Israel, you have to understand with your own kind of common sense whether it's referring to the people of Israel as people, as a nation, or whether it is referring to Israel as a geographical area. You get that idea? Sometimes you will be reading and you think, what does it mean Israel? Israel moved on. The land doesn't move on. So land is still there. So this bit is important to remember. So this is the land of Judah. It became like southern kingdom, and that was the northern kingdom, known as Israel. The capital of Judah was Jerusalem, with the temple and all that. So that was important as well. Capital of Israel then became Samaria. So that's where the Samaria or Samaritans came from. Now that history then develops further. At this stage, you have two kingdoms after Solomon. Southern kingdom and northern kingdom. Or sometimes it's also referred to as Judah or as Israel.
So how long were they united as one country then?
From the time of Joshua,
So even under Joshua, although it was 11 tribes.
he was the one who conquered the land, and then he gave to
So
the
even
tribes.
though the 11 tribes all still are under one person.
Yeah, they were under. Then the first king is really they were united, or as one sort of country, times of Judges. Then moving on to Samuel, and then the first king, Saul. I mean, there was always losing bit of land and gaining some more. And King David was the one who gained actually all the surrounding areas, added a bit more because that was the more powerful sort of king of Israel. And then Solomon, he fell into sort of a lot of things, idolatry and things like that. And therefore it says it was actually punished, and God told him, after your death, your land will be divided. And that's when the land was divided. So on this side, there were actually two tribes on this side. Only I think Simeon and Judah. But Judah becomes the main sort of land. And the rest of them were there. Syria, you see, it's still there. Was this? That time it was known as the Assyria as well. So then the book of Chronicles actually talk about that period of the divided land as well. Who wrote it, we don't know exactly, but it was written around 450 to 425. Jewish tradition has traditionally ascribed the book to Ezra. Some even say probably Nehemiah. Strong focus on the temple. So some say probably it might have been written by Ezra or Nehemiah and someone from the kingdom of Judah. Why? Because the temple was there. So that's why it talks about the strong emphasis on the temple, on priesthood. It could have been somebody as a Levite, might have wrote as well. Because Levites then were attached to the temple. And it has a lot of emphasis on David or on the kingdom of Judah. So the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles actually talk a lot about the temple, about the priesthood, and about Judah and David. Again, and the books of 1 and 2 Chronicles cover the same period of history as Kings, but the perspective is very much different. So you will see if you're reading the books of Kings and the Chronicles, you'll find stories are very much similar, or some stories are repeated, but slightly different angle on some of them. Some will be putting more focus on God, that how God is working throughout the history of Israel. Some will put as how people are behaving, so to say. So slightly different angle, but similar stories. Through these books seem like a repeat of Samuel and Kings, but they are written for the returned exiles to remind them that they came from the royal line of David and that they were God's chosen people. We'll be talking about exile because it's important to understand. Second Chronicles talks more about the destruction of the temple. Do you know when it happened? Don't worry. You'll know in minutes. It ignores the northern kingdom because of the apostasy and total absence of any godly kings. So we've spoken of the divided kingdom. So we'll talk more about it, but Book of Chronicles actually has more focus on Judah because that lasted much longer. And it talks less about the northern kingdom, which was Israel. The focus is on the kingdom of Judah because they had godly kings, and that's where David ruled, or David's sort of line. Then there were holier sort of kings following that. Then we have the book of Ezra. It talks after the exile, he comes back from the exile. I'm leaving that question hanging there of exile because I'm going to talk about it. But then you can place these once you understand when exile happened and who was in the exile and how they came back. So Ezra and Nehemiah, they lived at the same time. And they both were in exile, which was, some say, period of 457 to 444. Jewish tradition ascribes authorship to Ezra. Tradition holds that Ezra was the founder of the great synagogue where the canon of old scripture was settled. Remember when we were talking about the canon of the Bible? When was the Old Testament books decided? 39 books. I mean, we know the others were apocrypha book and they were decided during the Christian era, so to say, after Christ. But the canon 39 books, some say, was decided actually by Ezra or during his time, and since then we have the 39 books. Another tradition says that he collected the biblical books into a unit and that he originated the synagogue form of worship. Ezra again continues the narrative where 2 Chronicles ends and traces the history of the return of the Jews from exile in Babylon, a rebuilding of the temple, and from spiritual and doctrinal standpoints. Ezra demonstrates how God fulfilled his promise. So when you're thinking of book of Ezra, I think the key thing to remember, 2 things if you can remember, when you hear or read the book of Ezra. Returning from exile, Babylonian exile, and rebuilding temple. Remember, the temple was built by Solomon and it was destroyed a few years later, and it was rebuilt again and then destroyed again during the time of Romans in 70. And that's where, if you go to the Holy Land now, all you have is the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall there. And that was since 70, it's been like that. Nehemiah lived at the same time, like Ezra. Some say he himself might have written that book, or others say Ezra might have written, but they were both contemporaries. Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries. The other bit was Ezra was a priest and involved in the religious restoration, whereas Nehemiah was a layman and served as a governor in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. So he came from exile in Babylon, Persia, and then to oversaw the work. Book of Esther. Where did it happen? That also gives you an insight of the history of the world, but also what's happening today in contemporary history. Where is Book of Esther based in? Do you know? Persia. Present day Iran. You see the history of how it goes, how it's connected. Present day Iran.
Iran, oh, okay.
Yeah, that's where the Book of Esther is, and that's where the Jews actually lived for a while in Iran. I think I'll come to it when we talk about exiles. So it's not like what's happening today is sort of disconnected from the history. There's been lots going on back and forth, starting, as I said, from the time of Joshua. Maybe you can take it back to that time. It's been happening a lot since then. Author no certain date, sometime between 470 and 467. But whoever was the writer knew the Persian culture well. Some have suggested Ezra or Nehemiah because they were in exile as well. So similar kind of periods. Esther tells the story of a beautiful Jewish girl whom King, whatever the name is, of Persia chose to be his queen. So you see, he was the king of Persia, Iran, where Esther actually serves.
That's because they were in exile.
She was in exile, yes, of course. Risking her own life, she appeared to the king not to kill the Jews and rescued them.
Don't they say with Esther, it's the one book that it's not doesn't mention God. So although she does this work, it's the God is never mentioned.
Is he Ruth?
I don't know.
I think it's Ruth.
No,
The roots is
With Esther, they just get mentioned.
could be, I don't know.
Trouble in the pond.
Yeah.
Did you get that from Wikipedia?
No, it's just, I just learned it once.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that stick. Yeah.
I'll have to look
Look up
at.
again, yeah.
Then we have book of 1 and 2 Maccabees, and they are apocryphal books, but joined in because they talk about the history of Israel. You won't find this in the sort of Protestant books, sort of among 66 books. That's more like closer to the 1st century BC. Date about 170 to 135 BC, author uncertain, someone who was a native of Palestine. Books 1 and 2 provide a vivid account of Jewish resistance to the religious suppression and Hellenistic culture. So you're moving on from sort of a Assyrian, you're moving on from Babylonian, you're moving on from Persian Empire, and then comes sort of the Alexander the Great, so to say, the Greek Empire. And that's where the stories of Maccabees 1 and 2 take place. Its object is to encourage and admonish the Jews to be faithful to the religion of their fathers. There's a story which I think is read as part of the lectionary, obviously in the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church. A very powerful story, obviously, you might say a horrible story as well. There's a mother, when they're being forced to eat the food that the Jews don't eat, and the king orders that all the Jews sort of should eat that food. And there's a mother who has 10 sons or something like that. And she says, I'm happy for my sons to be sacrificed rather than to break the law of the Lord. It's that kind of story. But what they're stressing is really the element of being faithful to God in the face of even difficulties and challenges. And that's the kind of point that the book of Maccabees try to make. Faithfulness to God in the face of the opposition. Another apocryphal book in the book of historical books, it's kind of a novel, somebody would say. It doesn't talk really a lot about the history. This book tells the story of a righteous Israelite of the tribe of Naphtali named Tobit living in Nineveh after the deportation of the northern tribes of Israel to Assyria in 721. This is actually also, if you want to remember your history, key point in the history of Israel. This year is a key one. And that's when, I'll talk about it, but that's when the northern kingdom fell. So that's the turning point. Any books, any prophets. So also one point, maybe next time we'll talk in the next session, when you're talking about prophets, you would also see they had their own specific prophets. There were prophets who were only in the northern kingdom, and there were prophets who spoke only in the southern kingdom, in Judah or some in Israel. And I think it's Amos who tried to cross the border. People told him, go back to your country. We don't need you. We don't need your preaching. That's in the prophets, but that's where, when you study some of the prophets, then it's important to understand that bit of history of divided kingdom.
So
This
did
is
did Assyria conquer them, or was it says that you said they fell, the kingdom fell? Was it conquered, or did it just sort of collapse?
Well, they were conquered.
Sort of conquered.
I'll say more about it in the next slide. Yes, but this is, yes, they were.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to it as well, which has, even today, people ask the questions about when it comes to it. But this is a key date to remember. There's another one, which will be when Judah fell as well. So to say, when Judah was conquered as well. So those 2 days, 587 and 527. Key date, if you can remember. So Judith, again, is considered kind of a historical novel like Tobit. Again, a story of really courage and faithfulness, like the story of Ruth, more or less. It's also an apocryphal book as well. Now, this is the bit, next few slides. You see the area today. This is kind of the present day geography. This is Israel here. They came from Egypt. This is the land they had during the time of sort of Joshua, Saul, David, Solomon, and all that kind of thing. Syria up there, which is still there. Jordan here down there, which is up there. There's Lebanon, I think, up there somewhere on there. Iran here. But keep in mind this area. There's a lot of movement happens around that area where I put this circle. So there's a lot of history of Judaism there. Now look side by side. This is the map I showed you already. When Joshua sort of divides the lands. This is the divided kingdom after the death of Solomon from 950 BC. Judah and Israel, or Jerusalem as capital and Samaria as capital. That's what they had. And more or less that's where they are today as well. Isn't it?
Mm.
In between there is, I think, the Gaza and all that, because Egypt is here. So probably there's somewhere here, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, somewhere there. Now, these are the dates I was saying to remember. We said 721, when some would say 725, 22, but somewhere 720s. So what happens, coming back to your question as well, is Assyria was, let me go here first, then I'll come back to there. You see, this is Jerusalem. This is basically Israel. Now what happens, there's a lot of movement, rise and fall of empires. As we know, it's been happening throughout the history. So once the kingdom of United Kingdom of Israel was sort of formed, few years later, what happens is Assyria up there was a great, I think it used to have, oh, whatever. Assyria was a great power, the great empire, sort of in the 700, after 800 to 700 something. So what they did was, they conquered the whole of this area, including the northern kingdom, which is up there. So what did they do? There was a difference between the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. The difference was the Assyrian, whenever they conquered the areas, they did not take people away. The Babylonians did that. So you don't talk about exile during the destruction, so to say, or fall of the time of Assyria in 721. What did they do? They brought their own people to the areas that they conquered, and they made them what we talk today as settlers. They settled in sort of their own people in there. So what happens after a decade, 2, 3, 4 decades? People living side by side, living together, intermarriages, relating to each other, worshipping together and things like that. And that's what then some of those tribes, 10 tribes, or they talk about 10 tribes even today, lost their own identity. And today you talk about, there's a lot of material going on which says 10 lost tribes of Israel. Where did they disappear? Some people try to trace their history, or some say there might be some of them living in Afghanistan, or some in the other part, or this part, or that part, or that. But that's when those 10 tribes were lost. They lost the northern kingdom. The Assyrians came, started living there, marriages and all that. So the people living here, what do they think? They're still safe, they're still well and good. Northern kingdom was part of theirs, they were their brothers or sisters, whatever, the same tribe. But once they started intermarriages, the idol worship, so to say, and all that kind of thing, they started looking down at them. And that's where, when you hear about the, and capital of that was Samaria. So they were known as Samaritan people. So that's where, in Jesus' time, when you see a good Samaritan and people avoiding the Samaritan areas, there are still some Samaritans living there today. Some of them, even today. I think we went to the area on one of the visits that I did to the Holy Land. We went to Jacob's Well. That area is, that's where Samaritans still live there. But that's where you have to go to understand. At Jesus' time, that hatred, kind of looking down at the Samaritan, goes back to 721. Because those people had left their faith, they were not being faithful to God, and therefore they are not the right sort of Jews.
Yeah.
You see the connection now?
Yeah.
So that's when, so they were not really taken into exile. They sort of, the Syrians just came and overtook the area, brought their own people, and that's the end of those 10 tribes.
So they were assimilated. You know?
Yes, assimilated. A few centuries later, you don't even know who's who. Really. So then what happens later on? Judah is still there. They still have got their kings and so on, and they still got their prophets and so on. Again then, now there's Syria. Then what happens after Assyria is Babylon becomes a superpower. So it overtakes Assyria, overtakes all the areas of the whatever was under the control of Assyria. it becomes Babylonian territory now. But in addition to what they have, is they also overtake Judah. So they not just conquer the land of Judah, the southern kingdom, they also destroy the temple. And in contrast to the Assyrians, they take people back to their capital or their sort of heartland. And by the way, Babylon, is the area that is today's Iraq. Today's Iraq is known as the Babel. I think there is still a city there in Iraq which is known as Babel. So Babel was at that time a capital, so they were known as the Babylonians. And when did that happen? In 500 and it says 86, some dates would say 587. So, in 721, half of Israel gone, sort of the kingdom. In 587, the whole of the land is gone under different people. So what they did was, the Babylonians, they would take the good and fit and healthy men, especially, and they will take them to their land. And that's where they exile. Start talking about exile from the Babylonian time. And that's where Ezra and Nehemiah and Jeremiah, when you're talking about prophets, they lived at the time of exile. These people up there, northern kingdom, never came back. They were, as Kevin was saying, they were just assimilated. But these people, when they were taken into Babylon, they still lived in a kind of an area, and they were allowed to practice their faith and religion. So they could still worship God. On the rivers of Babylon. You sing that, no? Sometimes it is one of the psalms. How could we sing on the rivers of Babylon? That's what they're talking about. And then they were allowed, actually, a few years later. So they're living there, they can practice their faith, but they still remember their land. And when we were talking about then Nehemiah and Ezra coming back and rebuilding the temple, that's when the temple was destroyed, 587, by the Babylonians. Then what happens? The Babylonian Empire falls to the Persian Empire. Going, you see here. So we had the Assyrians taking this area, then we had the Babylonians here coming and taking this area, then we had the Persians coming and overtaking all this area. And some of them were already, so the Babylonian Empire became kind of Persian Empire. So Israelites, those in exile, were still living there. And they were still allowed to practice their faith. And you remember I said, whatever the name, that king, in the book of Esther. Mm-hmm. They were here that time then, this Persian, here. And that's where the book of Esther takes place. Mm-hmm. And the king was nice and kind, and then it was here, they allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to go back. Ezra was a prophet and a priest. And he went back and he started building the temple. Nehemiah was actually a governor here under a Persian king. So he was actually allowed to go back as well. And the Persian king also helped them to actually rebuild the temple financially. So they gave them the freedom. And it was after 70 years or so living under Babylonian exile and then the Persian exile that after 70 years then they came back. So that's why when Ezra and Nehemiah come back, they rebuild the temple. If you read their books, and people are so emotional when they hear the word of God being read, they are in tears that God has allowed us to come back to our own land and worship again the temple. So that's when the second temple was built. So you see the history. So, I mean, Iran being involved, Iraq being sort of in that area, and Syria. So this has been going on for centuries. It's not something something new. And maybe if you really, what do you say, love your history and love going back to it, and that's where some of the Jews, even today, they will say, this is our history. This is what happened to us. This is what these people did to us. Sort of when you're looking at Assyria, Babel, Persia and all that kind of thing. And there's that hatred today as well. So it's not something new. We might think, I think we were talking the other day, we saying it's the fault of the British, what they did. Somebody was saying in 1948, look what we did. Actually, no, it's not really what you did. It's been there.
Going on.
But in 1948, they basically gave them back the area that was the sort of the southern and northern kingdom, didn't they? We're going right back to there.
Yeah.
Right back to their very
yeah.
beginning of their history, sort of thing.
Exactly, and I think the reason for giving them that area was really to looking at the history of that. And it's a very complicated history. Now, you look, I've seen some photographs on the Facebook, for example, going around, where you have the, what is it? Where's the Al-Aqsa Mosque? And next to it is the Dome of the Rock.
Yeah.
That there. No, there are a lot of people actually showing, especially from Pakistan, with the Muslim sort of perspective and all that, saying this is a Muslim area, Muslim place. And you know how far it is from that Dome of the Rock and the mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque? It's literally few yards or hundred of yards away from the Wailing Wall, where the temple was. Now, without taking any sides with anybody, but looking at the whole picture objectively, this place, I mean, the Islam came in the 6th century. Now look back into sort of 2,000 years of history before that, or 3,000 of history. Whose place was that? Place of worship, the temple and all that kind of thing. And then the mosque is built in the 7th century. On the place where actually was the place of the temple of worship of Jews. So there's that, no, I mean, obviously for Islam it's the second holiest place after Mecca. So you claim that to be, that's fine. If you can live in peace and harmony and you say, okay, that's fine, you worship there. But if you don't want to, then you would say, actually this was our place and you came over and you sort of took over what was ours.
It's amazing how important Jerusalem is, isn't it, really?
Again, when you're talking about Jerusalem, sort of divided Jerusalem, again, when you're talking about Islam and all that, sort of, that's where the main conflict is, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Palestinian. But it's not just the nation, it's faith now. Because it's not just the Palestine has been there, the people have been there. Even I was talking to somebody, I said, even David and Goliath. That time you talk about the Philistines, no, isn't it? So Philistine, Palestine people as a nation have been there. But today it's not the people, it's the faith actually. That is causing all those problems. Again, you mentioned Jerusalem. I mean, you go back to King David. That's his place. At the sort of the capital and the place of worship and the temple and all. And when was temple built? During the time of Solomon. How far are you going? Now today, sort of even Muslims saying that this is our sort of city and our land. So it's a very complicated history. I mean, sometimes you need to go back into the history, both political but also sort of spiritual, religious history. Bethlehem, is called the city of David. And of course the city of the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. Do you know today, if you were to go there, you can go, but the Jews are not allowed to enter Bethlehem.
Why?
Because it's under the Palestinian authorities now. And Jews wouldn't go. It's not that they are not allowed. One hand, yes, they are not allowed, but on the other hand, the Jews wouldn't go to any area that is under the Palestinian authorities. So Bethlehem today is part of the Palestinian state. Therefore, any city, any town that is under them, the Jews wouldn't enter. So Jews today wouldn't go there. And anyway, they won't be welcome there either. You're talking about Bethlehem today, and you're talking about city of David. So it's a very complicated. I think even Hebron, where sort of Abraham came from, that area, that bit is under the Jewish authority. But there's so much security there, you can't really easily go there. So anyway, so this is the time actually, as I said, you remember, you need to know that even in the New Testament there are certain names, but when you read the prophets' books, when they're talking with the specific focus both on people and on the geographical area. So you'll hear a lot of prophecies, a lot of warnings in the until 721 about the Northern Kingdom. But once it's finished, nobody's talking about the Northern. There's no prophet there. And there's another interesting thing was as well. You know the story of the Samaritan women, where she says, we had a temple, we had our forefathers and Jacob and so worshipped it, and we have a temple here. What's the place called? Anyway, they had a mount there, we had a Mount Garrison, and we have the temple place of worship there. Because there was sort of, they had temple, so the Northern Kingdom, they were not allowed to go and worship there. So after the destruction sort of Assyrian Empire, so they had their own place of worship. And that woman makes a hint to that, doesn't she? We have our own place of worship. And we have our own well, Jacob's well, because our great grandparents actually had this well and they drank from it and so on. So they had shared history, but it was then later on, so they wouldn't want to go to each other's area. And Jesus actually, when goes there, so why is he talking to a Samaritan woman? So you see where this history goes to. This map is really good. It's in the book. I just photocopied it. How to read the Old Testament. How to read the Old Testament. There's this one because it just explains so beautifully that with the numbers. Number 1, there's the Syrian. Number 2, Babylonian. Number 3, sort of. Or this one's Babylon. Yeah. Number 4, Persian. Number 5, I think. Then after that, there's the Greek Empire, and then after the Greek there's the Roman Empire. So this story, and the Israelites were right in the middle of all this. You see that? Under every empire, they've been right there in the middle of it. I think towards the end. So this is actually the present day map. That is the map which is said of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. And this is the map today. See, this area is still there. This is the West Bank. So in that map, actually, this is that area.
The ways of Gaza Strip, that one on the right.
And yeah, Gaza is here, which is sort of Egypt here. So basically, this is the whole area, isn't it? When you look side by side. And that's obviously when you're talking about Gaza, obviously people would have been there, but not before the 7th century as just maybe Palestinians, but not as Muslim sort of Palestinians. So it's after the 7th century. Our Prophet Muhammad was born in 623. So it's sort of really the beginning of the 7th century when you had Islam spreading around in the world. And that's when they sort of came. But the Jews, so to say, I know they were dispersed, they lost their land and all that. But they've been there since. Whether it was right or wrong, as you say, when you go back to Joshua, obviously displacing then everybody else and just occupying that land. Obviously there were people living there. But since then, from the time of Joshua, it has been sort of their land. As can you compare the two? No? You see, it's still there. Everything's there. But the kingdom of Moab now is Jordan. Syria, that was Assyria that time. Lebanon is up there. See up there, Lebanon. Even then it was somewhere kingdom of the Aram and Damascus that was there that time. I think that's it. So any questions?
It's a lot to digest,
When
isn't
you're
it?
talking about the two kingdoms, I think the two key dates to remember are sort of after Solomon, the kingdom is divided into two, northern and southern kingdom, and then the northern kingdom falls in 721. So you don't see any prophets or so talking about the northern kingdom and all that. Then in 587, the southern kingdom falls, and people are taken into exile. And when you hear and people went into exile, and you're talking about prophets being in exile and talking to the people who returned from exile, that's where you would think that they were exiled in 587. That's when the temple was destroyed, and you think of Ezra and Nehemiah. They are the ones that they come from exile and rebuild the temple. And then the
What
history.
date was that?
Which one?
When they rebuilt the temple?
587 was
They destroyed it.
destroyed. So it was 70 years later.
Right.
Because they spent kind of 70 years in exile, and
Yeah.
they came. So what would be the year?
So around 500 and a bit.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
520.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so around that
I'd say
time.
520,
Yeah. So that time, and then that temple then was destroyed
In
in 70 by the Romans.
Yeah.
That's when you see the history moves on. That area has never been a peaceful area. So you had the Romans then overtaking sort of that area and destroying the temple, and people at Jesus' time were living under Romans. And before that, it was the Greeks. And then since then, after Jesus' time, then the story continues of fight and maybe times of peace in between and things like that.
Really see why it's such
Well,
a
yeah, the
snap.
Egyptians are one.
No, I just wondered, I'm just thinking in Gaza now, the Israelis are trying to push people back down into Israel, I guess, because that's
No,
a
Egypt.
lot of
Egypt.
Egypt. Yeah, what did I say?
Yeah.
They've supposedly opened a safe port path for them to go into Egypt, haven't they? But
So they're going to welcome
But
them to do that.
That's the only place they can go now. There's
Yeah.
no other
It's
way.
the Rafah crossing.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the only, and that's what probably, that's what they would want, really, to leave everybody to live there, and
But
Yeah.
the
just
Egyptians,
have that.
the Egyptians don't want them because
No.
Hamas is a problem for Egypt in so much as
Yeah.
terrorists and Hamas strike at the tourists in Egypt, and Egypt relies on the tourists.
Yeah, they need
I mean, it's-
yeah.
It's easier for example, this area for sort of to survive. You see at the West Bank it says Hebron. Hebron was a place where Abraham came from. So you see today it's under the West. So for Jews actually, there's a lot of history there for them. I mean, they definitely will trace Abraham.
Was the West Bank ceded after the 6 Day War?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And even the Golan Heights.
Because the Golan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what else comes under the main Jericho, for example? Again, Jericho. For Jews, I mean, that was the first place where they entered into, and that's under West Bank today as well. So, I mean, for them, yes, there was a division, sort of two-state. We are talking about the true state, but there's a lot of Jewish history there, and it's not just a political history. There's a lot of faith history living there, and imagine when Jews probably think of these places of Hebron, Bethlehem being the city of David, Hebron being the place of Abraham, and then Jericho being the place where they first entered, and that's when they read the Bible today. These are all part of their history, their story. And there's spiritual kind of emotions involved as well. I know it's not easy, but I remember when I was in Chile, I used to take service at St. Raphael's Hospice once a month, next to St. Anthony's. And it was a monthly service, and there was a lady who worked there, and she used to come for the Mass. And one day after the service, she came and she said, you know, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Palestinian Muslim, but I like to come to the service. And she said, you know why? Because I like to hear from the Bible, because the places and the names and all that when you read are mentioned actually are the place that where I come from. And I feel like emotionally attached to this. And one of the places, I think it was Bethlehem or something, she said, I live only sort of few yards away from that place. So you see, I mean, when we hear of places, when we are abroad or somewhere else, we feel that sense. And the West Bank, I mean, probably there are others, but those are the key places. Jericho is there, Bethlehem is there, Hebron is there. And then Jerusalem obviously comes quite next to it. That's where the beach is.
So when did the Palestinians take Bethlehem? I mean, so they've got that state now. And
Well,
what
it's
does
part
it
of the
mean to
West
them?
Bank.
What does it mean to them really? Nothing, does it? Not Bethlehem, surely.
Spiritually maybe not, but as a land, obviously, if you've been living there, then it becomes your country, you know, your place of birth, and yeah.
And that's
But
a long
spiritually, I mean, as I said, Islam came in the 7th century. So before that, they were just, so to say, Palestinian people, if it was. So Palestine as a country did not come into existence in 1947 there.
No.
In geographical area, it has been there. So there's been Palestinian people living there, but faith actually then moves as some of the areas where we find Christianity being the religion. A few centuries ago, it wasn't. And the same way where Islam is today, these countries as Muslim countries, before this 7th century, wasn't. Might have been some other faith or no faith.
And would there be many Christians now living in?
That's another interesting thing. When I've been there, as I said, 3 times, and our guide was a Palestinian Christian.
Sorry, sit down.
That's okay.
Thank
Twice.
you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Twice, I think the guide was a Christian, and he said, we talk about sort of the Palestinian Muslim suffering. He said the Christians actually suffer the same fate as Muslims. So for the Jews in certain areas, there's no difference between whether you're Muslim or you're a Christian. And he was saying a lot of the Christians actually have left, those who could, because of whatever is politically happening. So a lot of Christians actually have left Palestine, and those who could move to other sort of countries like USA or other European countries. So the Christians suffer kind of as well. So anybody, I mean, if there are Christians living in Gaza or West Bank, they'll be suffering the same like anybody else. So it's a shared kind of pain sometimes in certain circumstances. You forget about faith and religion because it's the pain and suffering, actually, as we know, do unite people.
You know, I'm just thinking out loud now. There is a temple, I think it's in Jerusalem, where you have to remove your shoes before you go in.
Oh, yes.
Where I think they said the stone. Yes.
I mean, in the mosque, definitely you have to Al-Aqsa Mosque, but I think that probably when you go to holy places, some places you would, like when we went to the Wailing Wall, we had to put a cap, and they have sort of disposable caps before you enter that area. They have caps for men and and for women they have to also scarves and things like that. And interestingly, before you enter that compound, there's a quote which when I went first time I read it and I can't forget. It says, "Remember the place that you are entering is holy and God's presence resides here." So that's just like before you enter the compounds of the Wailing Wall area. So for them, it's and I've seen actually some Jews sort of conservative and sort of very religious, literally crying, touching that wall, looking that way, and literally in tears, thinking that's their history. That's where God's presence was and resided there.
The Wailing Wall.
Yes.
Wailing Wall. It's all called Western Wall or Wailing Wall. And that's if you go next to it, because there is a narrow, that's open area, the wall area. Then on the right hand side, if you go through, there's a kind of a tunnel type, a little passage, corridor that you go into quite long. And that's where the Holy of Holies was on that side. You'll see Jews there with the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, really reading quite loud, and that's where probably some of them will be without shoes as well and things like that. And just praying the Psalms and praying the Bible in that area. You're allowed to go there. They just carry on sort of reading as they do.
And then we also wrote prayers and put it on the wall.
Yes, a lot of people and a lot of Christians go and do that. So I know there were people who gave me some and they said, can you pray for us and put this request there? Yes, people do as well.
There's a separating section where the women are on one side.
Yes, there is.
Because they aren't allowed on the other side.
No, there's a kind of a fence in between.
Yeah.
And women are on the right hand side and men are on the left. And that's where you can go into the kind of Holy of Holy areas, the men's side. Probably
Men's
women
side
are
on the
not
left,
allowed on that side. But even when the temple was there was an area which was designated for women. So the women's court, there was an area for women in the temple as well.
So the Muslims have followed that tradition then, haven't they? Because the Muslims have keep women and men separate in their temples and everything, don't they?
Yes, yeah.
The mosques and things.
And also the taking of shoes
Yes.
comes from the Bible. You remember the story of the burning bush?
Oh, the burning
We're
bush.
saying, take your shoes off the place that you're standing on. And in Pakistan, so it's not just a Muslim thing. I think there's a cultural element to that as well. In Pakistan, if you were to go to church, again, men on one side and women on the other, most churches, in some maybe in the big cities sometimes, but mostly men on one side and women on the other. But also, everyone will be taking their shoes off. So you enter like a St. John's, enter your church, and you see shoes sort of lying all
In some people's houses you have to do that too. And when I was working, you know.
That's a different reason. So.
No, definitely religious reasons.
Right? So no, maybe.
You know, they observed it in their house.
Yeah, but maybe somebody might think, but mostly we do it more like.
No, this was definitely Younis.
I'm not disagreeing. I said
Yes.
there might be some,
Yes.
but it's not general.
Yeah.
Kind of. Yeah.
But
But going to churches and things like that definitely is spiritual. But yeah, there might be somebody. I have also seen some people's house. Please take your shoes off. They put a note there. So,
yes.
so I don't know whatever reason that is, but there
I'd
was.
stay away, frankly.
Yeah,
No, this wasn't a custom. This was a definite religious thing.
could be somebody.
When
Yeah.
I was nursing it, when I was health visiting. Yeah.
Yeah, can be.
It didn't worry me. I did it, but I know there was a great upheaval with a midwife because she didn't want to take her shoes off. They wouldn't let her in to see the baby.
Yeah, can be. Yeah.
So,
But you won't find many examples. That's maybe there are exceptions, but like in Pakistan, it's a for religious reasons. When you go to church, you have to take your shoes off.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But that white area on that map now,
Yes.
would that be Iraq then?
Iraq is probably down.
No.
No, be up to the right.
So what would the white area be then?
I mean,
Carving out of Israel.
But then if you look at this is just to highlight the important areas. So if you were to look sort of some of the map, you see there's Iraq here, there's Israel is here, then you have Jordan, then you go Saudi Arabia,
Okay, yeah.
then you Iraq, then you go Iran there,
Yeah.
and this is Lebanon, Syria, Israel. Egypt. So I just wanted to highlight it.
Yeah.
So this is kind of wider picture. So next session we will talk about the prophets. So maybe next then you will be able to picture some of them preaching in the northern kingdom, some in the southern kingdom, and the type of message they had. So, thank you very much.
I just wanted.
All the time he was praying, but he was trying to do it.
He wasn't, I mean, any layman can pray. What layman means is, it wasn't kind of from the Levite line like the designated priest and spiritual person. It was more like political but very good.
Is this on the head?
So, yeah.
That's my little pages.
Oh, yes, the reason I know because we mega lads, actually, I think it was moved.
It's the Old Testament.
Yeah,
This is Philistia.
yes,
That's Samaria. So you're talking about here. This is Judea. This is Samaria. So that's kind of the United Kingdom. And that's where then the division was. You see Samaria being capital in the United Kingdom. And Judea being here, Jerusalem being the capital. So you're talking about biblical land. And that's one cases where I was saying this marriage woman said, well, we pray, we have a temple and we pray at one where the well is. It still exists in the well. I went and drank water from it.
It's a long time now.
Yes, really so, we can't come next week, we've got to take my uncle to the hospital.
I'll be recording, so you can
Seat was a bit false.
That's all right, no problem. Would you want to get this
Thank you very much.
very loud back.
Yeah.